hopefully, or good morning rather. Wow, time flies, huh? Um, so I'll be your quick moderator for the day. And just to introduce myself, my name is Anik Conley Das. I've been in the startup community in the people space specifically for a little over a decade now. And I don't see too many familiar faces, unfortunately. But hopefully, if anybody knows me, you know that I'm really passionate about people, the transition of people into various, organizations, and mergers and acquisitions hits home for me personally, as I've been on both the acquiring side and the acquired side. So I hope to facilitate this conversation with our expert on this matter, Deepti. I'm going to turn it over to Deepti if you want to introduce yourself.
Of course. So, firstly, great to see everyone, and thank you so much for having me. I'm Dipti Salapak, and the Chief People Officer at Corvus Insurance. I have embarrassingly been in this space for probably 20 years, 2 decades. That's double Anik's time. And again, just like Anik, very passionate about M&A. I actually spent 2 years working at American Express, specifically in their M&A team. And my job was we were acquiring a lot of companies, and my job was to help integrate those companies into our business. So I've spent a lot of time thinking very deeply about what makes acquisition successful and what doesn't. And I'm super happy to share as much as I can that would be helpful for all of you.
All right. Thank you, Deepti. I think I wanted to start off the session today by quickly asking what you all want to get out of this session. If you're a founder or if you're a people ops person, there are different sort of, I guess, takeaways that Deepti and I will be discussing throughout our conversation. But a quick raise of hands in the audience here. Are you a founder? If you are, raise your hand. In process. Awesome. Early entrepreneurs. Love it. Anybody in the people ops space or talent space? Awesome. All right. So I think Deepti, I think we'll hit on a little bit of both, if that makes sense. And online audience, if you are chatting in the tool, go ahead and drop in who you are, what you're sort of looking to get out of it, and would love to come back and address any questions that can come up throughout the session. All right. With that, I think we wanted to get started by just having a quick discussion about you've either gotten to know that you're acquired, or you've just been acquired, or you're in the process of even going and getting an acquirer, or acquiring an entity. Where do you start? What do you do? I think the first sort of set of questions that we want to dive into is generally sort of the planning phase, or even the pre-planning phase, if you will. So I've always been of the mindset that you need to know what you're acquiring and what you're getting. And Deepti, I'd love to hear your perspective, but what are maybe some of the types of acquisitions that you've worked through? What are sort of the main takeaways of that particular session? And what are you sort of looking to get out of that acquisition? And what does that mean sort of down the road as part of this acquisition process?
Yeah. And maybe you all have kind of read some of these stats as well, but maybe about 70 to 80% of acquisitions end up being unsuccessful. And I don't say this to scare anyone, but that is kind of the fact. And the reason is because people aren't as thorough as we should be, and that includes myself. We aren't as thorough as we should be in defining what is the goal and the business case of the acquisition, and what are the value drivers in the first place. Once you've articulated and aligned that correctly, then everything else naturally falls into place, right? So there's two initial vectors I think of when I look at acquisition. A, is it an asset deal or a share deal? And so when you think of an asset deal, that's like you look at a company and you say, I want to buy your IP, or I want to buy your customer base. So some part of the company, not the whole company itself. I don't want all your liabilities, and maybe I don't even need your people. All I need is this part of the company. That's an asset deal. And you'll see this very often happen when a company divests some part of their business. Like, oh, we want to divest the European part of our business, whereas we keep the US part and double down and focus on that, or whatever it might be, right? So that's kind of an asset deal, and you look at that differently. A share deal is when you buy the entire company lock, stock, and barrel. So you're buying basically the shares that exist for the entire company. And then you own everything, the people, the IP, the tech, the product, the liabilities, the financial books, all of that comes with you, right? And so it's super important that you figure out the kind of deal transaction that you're going for based on what your actual goals are. So now you think about, like, why am I even acquiring this company? What's the business case? What are the value drivers? Sometimes it is, hey, I just need that IP. Sometimes it is, I just need that IP to not be in the market because it's a key competitor. So I'm going to do nothing with it, but I'm going to acquire it so it cannot exist and compete against me. Sometimes it is, I want the customer base because it's a new revenue channel for me that's adjacent to what I'm actually currently doing. Sometimes it's getting into a new geography. Sometimes it's the talent play. I need those people because they can do something that I just have not been able to build organically. You need to be able to pinpoint that, because then that will dictate, hey, do you want to do an asset deal? Do you want to do a share deal? And how are you measuring the value and the success of this transaction after that? So to Anik's point of where do you even start? You start by defining, what are you trying to get to? Like, why are you even trying to do an acquisition? What are you trying to get to?
Thank you, Deepti. I hope that spurs on some good thoughts for other folks to jump in and ask more questions. I think, to reiterate, the goal of the actual acquisition should be your starting point or consideration of a starting point. So I think one of the bigger questions that comes out at this particular phase, as you're planning, as you're preparing, as you're sort of setting that goal and understanding why you want to be acquired or why you want to acquire an entity, and for what purpose, I think the sort of question comes to mind: how does a people leader in this space sort of support this activity? I'm a strategic people leader, Deepti as a chief people officer, me as a VP of HR. What do we do, or what can we do to really support this strategic activity that touches almost every aspect of either entity, right? If you're being acquired or if you're acquiring that entity. So, Deepti, I would love to hear your perspective on some of the things you've done as a people leader in this kind of capacity.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, obviously, as a people leader, your primary concern is not the IP or anything, it's the people being impacted, right? So, trying to figure out. So, for the first piece of advice I would put, whether you're the acquiree or the acquirer, as a people leader, don't make yourself the afterthought. You should be involved right from the beginning of the deal. And I'll give you an example. Once in my past life, we acquired a company that it was a conference company, and it was basically only two people. And what we really wanted was the IP of the conference, the rights to the conference, because they had a phenomenal, external audience base, and they drove a big community. That's really what we wanted, right? So not at all a people related deal. And I thought, two people, I'll come in at the end, I'll help sort it, but I'm not the primary player. Now it turned out that those two people lived in a country which had very different regulations, and we couldn't acquire them without a specific kind of entity that we didn't want to get into. And it almost stymied the deal right at the end because I hadn't looked at it at the beginning. So my bottom line is, however many people there are, whatever the real driver is, you've got to think about it right from the beginning, because this is a big part of the assets that you're inheriting, is the people side of the equation. And now, if the reason behind the acquisition is really talent oriented, like you want to keep the people, and that's a really important part of this, then you've got to be like hands-on from the beginning. How are we going to retain people? What's our strategy? Who are the key and critical people that you absolutely cannot afford to lose? There might be certain people that you're like, if they don't accept this offer, the deal's off, like an actual legal contingency on certain people coming as a part of the transaction. So there's a lot of ways to think about it, and you as a people leader can be front and center of that conversation and of the negotiation. You've just got to make sure that you're included in the conversations at the outset. Typical risks to look for, typical issues that could come up right at the outset. So just to keep an eye at is works councils, which is like trade unions. So depending on the country that you're working with, you might have to negotiate with those. Any kind of regulatory, like, so for instance, Europe has a lot more protections and a lot more regulatory requirements than we might face in the US. Any kind of employee claims, like what if there's a lawsuit going on? How do you find out? Because you could inherit the liability of that. Any kind of, if you're in US focused, any kind of 401k non-compliance could put you in a big world of hurt if you haven't like investigated that up front and known what you're inheriting. So again, like these could be like big derailers because they could create a lot of liability that you inherit that might actually detract from the gains that you're trying to get. So as a people leader, or if you're a founder and you're thinking, do I need, like, is my people leader relevant? Yes, you need to bring them into the process early on to do this level of due diligence.
Thank you. That's actually very, very helpful. And I think I want to add a couple of points there just to kind of highlight this. One of the benefits of bringing in a people leader early on is because they may know how certain people, as part of the deal that are specified, as an example, would stay or not, right? They have a good understanding of what this transaction could mean for that individual if you're being acquired. One of those considerations is compensation. So if there's a mechanism, or if there's some level of compensation that the expected party is sort of shared with your people leader, I think that's a very practical way to say, hey, people leader, come in. I want to understand how this person's compensation and how that would translate into this next acquired entity, and ultimately the sort of integration process. How do we hang on to this person? I think that's to sort of reiterate some of Deepti's point there, but I think that's one of the clear practical value adds that a people leader could bring to the mix. And that goes for both sides, right? Having conversations, if you're acquiring an entity, having conversations ahead of time with the people being acquired or being acqui-hired, if you will, whichever sort of makes sense there. And one more sort of point on this, I think Deepti mentioned sort of, making sure that there is a lot of time to suss out essentially a lot of the details as part of the deal. We'll go into some of the structures and timelines in just a minute, but due diligence period. I want to introduce this term, due diligence, as part of the acquisition process, where you'll have a lot of time on both sides to sort of see what skeletons are in the closet potentially. So that's something that Deepti and I will be talking about as part of sort of the next phases here. So I think moving on now, hopefully you have an understanding of purpose. How does your people leader fit into this sort of activity that is extremely strategic and sensitive? Where do you go from here? How do you sort of plan? What are some of the big areas that you need to consider as you're sort of pursuing this deal, closing out this deal, or however, so whichever stage you're in? So I think one of the biggest, and I would say hairiest aspects of this is, when do you start to communicate? You have a potential buyer, you have a potential entity that you're looking to acquire. As a founder, as a sort of leadership team, when do you start to talk about this, and how do you start to talk about this? So I think, Deepti, you've seen it from every angle here, right? I would love to hear your perspective on how you've approached sort of communications related to any acquisitions that have occurred, and some of the pitfalls potentially here as well.
Yeah. I mean, look, everyone thinks through communications first because it's the part that's it's more exciting and you want to get people along on this journey. You want to make a big announcement. There's often a lot of tension in the lead up to an acquisition. So you want to relieve that tension in the air. You want to be transparent. Maybe that's like a big value in your company. There's a lot of reasons. But here's what I've learned from doing it the wrong way several different times, is comms or communications is the last part of a journey. And that's because with that moment of making an announcement, you introduce so much more uncertainty, churn, insecurity along the way, that you owe it to your people to have at least some of those answers ready before you kind of toss them in the deep end, so to speak. So here's my recommendation through the process. First, just think about your operating model. Like, when are you going to integrate straight away and just become like another department in the new company that is acquiring you? Or if you're the acquirer, are you going to integrate the new company straight away? Or are you going to keep them separate as a standalone entity? Like there's rights and wrongs, pros and cons on both sides of this equation. So this isn't about there's one perfect model, but whatever the model that you decide to follow, figure that out, because that will be a lot of questions will depend on what's the next step for how you're going to operate on day one. Then the second piece is the roles of your executive team. If your current founders, and I know several of you are founders or planning to be founders or on that entrepreneurial journey, if you haven't figured out where you are going to play or where your head of sales, your CFO, your CTO, some of these roles, if you haven't figured out where they're going to be in the new world, what their job will be, what they'll be accountable for, they're not going to be able to bring their teams with them. Everyone's going to look at it and say, where's my boss landing? If I don't know that, that means there's insecurity ahead. And so stability of the top is a very important piece to just get landed. Then you need to figure out, before you communicate to anyone, what's the impact on employees? Are all employees going over? Yes or no? And if they're not, then are some being let go? When are they being informed? If everyone's going over, what's the impact on their compensation? Are they getting the same as they have today? Less? More? That's going to be the first question that people are going to ask. A, do I have a job? And B, what's my package going to be like? So you've got to have at least some directional answers, some principles agreed. And that's a big part of the negotiation of a transaction. So before you can communicate, you're some ways off from like actually just negotiating the purchase agreement and getting some of these terms hammered out. Now, the other warning I'd throw out there before communications is that the acquiring company could be a public company, whereas you might be a private company if you're being acquired. And any public company is beholden to shareholders and quarterly earnings and a whole levels and levels of kind of confidentiality that they cannot stress the market with or have insider information leak, things like that. So there's very different regulatory requirements if you're a public company. And so that might restrain or restrict what you can communicate and when. So these are just things to keep in mind. But then, of course, exactly to Anik's question, the next bit is communications. How do you do that? What do you do? When do you do it? Who knows first? Do you have a cascade? Do you have a one-off moment where you tell the whole company entirely? These are all parts of building out a really strong communication and change management strategy. And this might be the last piece in my 4-step process. I said, figure out the operating model, figure out your executive team, figure out how you're going to treat your employees. Are they all coming? What's their compensation going to be? And then communicate. So it might be the 4th step in my model, but actually this is probably where you will spend the vast majority of your time, because acquisitions are very emotional. They're very emotive. They create a lot of stress. And so providing stability, providing comfort, providing reassurance, providing optimism, and like helping people see the opportunity, that's a human change curve motion that you've got to take your whole company and your organization through. And it's harder and it takes longer than you think. So ultimately, even though it's the 4th step, it's the place where you will end up spending the majority of your time.
Thank you, Deepti. I hope that provided some clear sort of direction and steps in terms of what to sort of consider, think about, and pursue and execute on when considering this change, this big change happening. I wanted to add one thing, and sort of to Dipti's last point around communication. I think it's hyper important, whether you're a founder, executive team, people leader. This is a moment that is extremely emotional, as Deepti said. I encourage everybody to lead with empathy when pursuing, whether it's communications or even the deal itself. I think this is a human moment that impacts lives, livelihoods, families, and I just wanted to add that piece. That's from my experience. Every time I've been acquired or done the acquiring, I've tried to put that foot forward. Say to my executive team, say to my chief CEO, please, let's make sure that we are human in this moment when we talk to our people, that this big change is happening. So I hope that's something that everybody can take away. When the time is right, when you've sort of closed out the rest of these steps, when it's time to communicate, double down on empathy and lead with that. So I hope that sort of resonates with some folks that have been acquired. And if you've seen the good, the bad, and maybe even the ugly, I hope that that's not something you'll experience again, just being sort of cut out, no communication. I think that's something that none of us really desire here. So definitely sort of moving on from that point, I think there are lots of sort of different things to sort of pursue when it comes to, again, this acquisition, and essentially related to people, communications, etc. But I would say, what do you do as an employee? What do you do when you've just learned, as an example, if there's a company-wide announcement, hey, we're being acquired. What you as an employee would you ask? What should you consider? What should you do? Like, what happens in that moment? And I'm sure Deepti, you've seen both questions come from an audience that you've communicated to. Maybe you've been on the other side of it yourself. Love to hear your perspective on, as an employee, what happens? What do you do? What are some best practices?
Yeah. I think probably the number one piece of advice I'd give is just keep an open mind, because you will have an emotional reaction, and it could be positive or negative. It could be like, this is phenomenal, I'll be a part of this great company. And recognize that nothing's perfect. It probably won't, like, it'll end up having bumps along the road, even when you're excited about it. And the flip side is you could dread what's about to happen because you joined a startup and you don't want to be part of a big mothership company, whatever else might be in your mind at the moment. Just keep an open mind to what the opportunities are in front of you. That's probably the first thing I would say. Sorry. And then the other piece is just engage and ask questions. So if your company isn't holding a lot of, an extra amount of town halls or fireside chats or whatever enable question asking forums, then suggest it. Probably someone just hasn't thought about it or had the time to put it in place, but suggest it and push for it, because when groups are going through big change, it's about communication and dialogue. Like, that's what helps people get through it, manage the uncertainties, surface the insecurities, surface the frustrations. Like, all of that is a big part of the change curve. And this is the second time I referenced the change curve. So I want to take a step back and digress and talk about that. Like, some of you will be familiar with this concept of a change curve, and some of you might not be. And it basically looks like it starts at the top and it goes down into a big dip. It's a U-shaped curve and comes up at the top again. And it talks about the different emotions we go through when faced with a massive change in life. It starts with denial, and then anger and frustration, and then depression and fear, and then things start to resolve, and you get some optimism, and you get hope, and you get stability, and you get security, and you come out the other side of it, of that and like, people go through that at very different paces, and it affects people differently. So I'll give you an example. One of the companies we acquired, we were like, everyone's getting an offer, and in fact, everyone's getting salary increases. Fantastic. This is like, they'll all be over the moon. The number one thing that bothered people was the fact that we had offices, and sorry, they had an office, and we were a remote first company. And we were like, it doesn't work with an office space. Like, majority of what you do is on your laptop, it's on your screen, and you're going to be working with people who are remote. And they'd been used to just huddling together as a small team. That was a very big cultural challenge for that company that we just hadn't even anticipated. And the only way that surfaced was through dialogue, through asking, like, what's working, what isn't working, what's frustrating. And so whether you're the acquiring company or the acquiree, I'd say keep an open mind and lean in on forums of communication, because that change curve for both sides of the equation is much harder and takes much longer than you think it will. It always does.
Yeah, and I just want to add, I think there's one specific area where the emotions run probably the highest, and that's your package, your role, your comp, your what does this mean kind of situation. So I think, especially in regards to that, I think one of the things to keep in mind is everybody is going to figure it out. It does take time. And I think that's part of the disconnect here. It's a long process, usually, right? There's a waiting period. There's lots of different sort of elements and complexities that go into closing a deal like this. So as a result, there may not be perfect communication at all times. There is ambiguity as part of this process. And to Deepti's point, to highlight this as an employee, if you are being acquired, number one thing, just keep an open mind to start. Just because know that there's a long road ahead and you may not even get all of your answers by that end, and you have to still continue sort of pushing and figuring it out. I hope that's not the case, but the reality is this is an ambiguous process. So just to highlight that. And with that, I think the timeline component here is something I wanted to highlight for a second, just because I think a lot of folks are thinking about, well, how long does this take? Like, what are the different procedures and steps that you have to take to, again, initially propose a deal, find a suitor, make that match, close the initial deal? What happens? What happens from that point? So Deepti, could you actually kind of walk us through some of the best practices around the procedures? I mentioned this concept of a due diligence period. When do you announce? When do you announce the company? There are lots of different, again, steps and procedures. So if you could highlight some of that, I think it would be helpful.
Yeah, I think the best analogy I have is it's like buying a house. For those of you who've been in the house purchase market and had that arduous experience, there's a point where you look at the house and you're like, I kind of like it, and you throw out a verbal offer, and it gets accepted. Right. So that's one stage, is both of you have just reached top level terms. Then that starts a level of due diligence. So you get a contractor in or an inspector in and kind of do the inspection, and then realize that the bathroom shower doesn't work and all these other things. And you come back and say, there's this problem and that problem, so I'm going to negotiate the price. And actually, if you throw in the furniture for free, I'll give you this extra thing, whatever it might be, right? You start getting into the nitty-gritty of the terms. And so then there's this period of sign when you're buying a house, which is, hey, I'm entering into a contract with you. So now we're in exclusivity. That means you're not selling the house off to anyone else. We take it off the market. And then you continue kind of haggling on the deal terms for a little bit more. And then you reach agreement and every last bit of detail. And then you get to what's close. And that's when the money transfers hands. I write you a check, you give me the deeds, and we've actually purchased the house. And now that's just for a house, let's say $500,000, right? So that's the amount of due diligence that goes into a house. So now imagine buying a company for, say, $100 million. Right? All of this gets expanded. It's essentially the same steps, but a lot more due diligence and a lot more thoroughness, because there's a lot more liability at stake here. So once you've seen a company that you kind of are interested in pursuing this and going down the road with, you create what's called a term sheet. That's that top level offer. I'm going to give you 500 grand. Are you good with it or not? Right? Like, so what's the top line term sheet that says, I'm buying your company for, I'm going to choose round numbers, 100 million. And am I paying for it with cash, or am I paying for it with shares, or like, what's the process? Or am I raising money and doing a debt equity kind of deal? What's the process by which I will come up with money to give you what I'm offering you, right? So that's a term sheet. Everyone agrees at the high level. Then you start the due diligence. Then you start looking into it and being like, do I really like this tech? Like, that's the reason I thought I was buying this company. Does it really make sense? And you start looking into the finance books, and you start looking into the people and how much are they paid and can we afford them? All of those pieces. And once you feel some reasonable level of security, you get into the next stage, which is called deal sign. Like, okay, we've agreed most of the terms, so let's sign a purchase agreement. And then you get into much more thorough kind of due diligence on the nitty gritty of all the last pieces of, hey, you had this customer, you didn't fulfill their contract, you owed them this much money. Is that on you or is that on me? Like all the last bits of those, we're closing down this office lease. Is that on your liability or is that mine? Right. So you start doing that. And for some instances, it depends on the size of the company. It depends if someone's public. It depends on the country. But there might be regulatory filings that you also need to do during this period. And so then you're waiting for, between deal sign and deal close, you're waiting for government approval to say you've met all those regulatory standards. And when that comes through, then you can close the deal. You've agreed every last piece of every last detail, and you've got all the regulatory approvals you need, boom, you can close. That's when you're writing the check, transferring the money, and literally you sign the paper, and then these people are yours. It's now your company to take home. So the time for any kind of buyer's remorse was before that last step of deal close. After that, go figure it out and make it a win. Now, I've seen, you asked, sorry, Anik, you asked about timeframes. I have seen these 3 steps of signing an LOI, that's the first term sheet. The LOI, that's deal sign and deal close, I've seen it happen concurrently, like literally the whole deal can happen very, very quickly. Or I've seen it like literally, I was talking to one of my friends who's head of people at another company, and their acquisition took 1.5 years. It took 18 months to get through these steps. So it depends on regulatory, it depends on due diligence, and it honestly depends on the acquirer's readiness to move forward.
Thank you, Deepti. I hope that that's something that everybody here can take away, just a general overview of how this all works. And just wanted to add, I think there is a lot of people involved in this process, if that wasn't sort of said, right? This isn't typically something that happens, you and your CEO in a room. This is lawyers, consultants, usually external parties to validate parts of this due diligence process that come in to take a look at all of this. Again, depending on the size of the deal, the complexity of the deal, if it's a public company, private company, there are lots of factors. But I will say that you are not going to be alone in this process in normal sort of circumstances. And one more thing to add, and I think this is one of the most sensitive topics, and that is what happens essentially when you are going through this process. When do you sort of share this news, et cetera? So I think there are certain points also where there's an external announcement that's made, or the press finds out, oh, there's an LOI on file, and Microsoft is going to buy X company for X amount of dollars. There's still a lot of ambiguity related to the sort of press and external communications and when the deal closes. So that's something to keep in mind as you are all looking at this. There could be a big announcement, a big news article about this out there, but the deal isn't closed yet. So be aware, there might be false hope. There might be sort of a level of ambiguity there again. And I think I read this question around, why do so many mergers fail? So Deepti, I don't know if you want to comment, but one of my immediate takeaways is there are some skeletons that emerge during the due diligence process, but the announcement has been made that this deal is happening. So there's a lot of sort of backtracking that needs to happen. But Deepti, I would love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, I've certainly seen that scenario, Anik, where the announcement's been made a little bit early, and then you find out stuff and you got to backpedal out of that. What I would say, and this is why I was like, comms should really be the last piece, not the first piece. What I would say is, if you're announcing before the deal is closed, then just put in enough caveats and uncertainty, I think, in how you communicate it. Like, I mean, it's fine to communicate it because we want to be transparent, but just putting in the right, like, we're in talks to have this, just setting expectations that this may or may not happen, but we want to be transparent with you as you explore this further. Those kind of things that just set the expectations of your people appropriately. The other areas, I saw the question too, and Anthony, thank you for asking it because I think it's a great question. The other areas that kind of leap to mind for me is Anik, you touched on this. You said there's a lot of people involved. There's the corp dev team, there's the external investment bankers, there's the board members. And trust me, your board members have very different agendas from what you do, because they have very different incentives. If your board members are investors, their incentive and what they owe their company is, how am I making money out of this exit? Right. So everyone is operating from a very different standpoint. The banker has a very different incentive than you, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think what often ends up happening is, as it gets through the negotiation, you start deviating from the original business plan, because you start thinking about, how am I going to sell this to shareholders? Let's make up this, not make up, but let's kind of evolve the story a little bit to sound a bit more shiny and a bit more glamorous for the next shareholder meeting or board meeting. So that, like, the story starts deviating 1 inch away from the original place that it was. And then an investor comes in and wants their money back, and they had a certain kind of preferred shares that you got to pay them at the beginning. And now the finances don't really work as well. And that story deviates 1 more inch away. And then the bankers are just trying to close the deal because they're only paid if the deal is closed. So they're like, whatever, I don't care about this term and that term. We're just going to push this through. And then it deviates 1 more inch away. And nobody is ill-intentioned, but with so many fingers in the pie, this is how it slowly starts happening, and it moves away from the original value case that started in the beginning. So I'd say that's one trend that I've observed that happens, and you've got to stay really close to that and guard it very deeply if you're the founder of the company you're selling or buying, whichever way. The second thing that I've seen is a real cultural difference. So you can have a large company, to go on Anik's example, right? Microsoft buys whatever. Now you have this 120,000 person company buying maybe a 50-person startup. Trust me, the communications, the culture, how decisions are made, how information is shared, what technology is used, all of that will be vastly, vastly different. And then sometimes it is so different and the gap is so unbridgeable that it breaks up the startup. Like, what made them successful was their agility and speed and ability to do things and collaborate together, and that goes away. And then suddenly the value of the company goes away. So you've got to, if you're the founder of a company you're selling, and especially if your earnout is tied to the success of the acquisition, but if you're the founder of a company you're selling, you've got to think, like, what made our company successful, and then safeguard that during the negotiation process. Like, how am I going to protect this, to use my own example, this agility and the collaboration and stuff? How am I going to protect that in the new world? Because otherwise I'm signing up to deliver on targets that I just don't think will happen. And so you got to be very mindful of that. So those are kind of the things that I think that I've observed over time. One is like how you start deviating away from the original business plan because there's so many different interests that you're trying to balance. And the second is this massive cultural divide that just becomes insurmountable and breaks the acquired company up.
Thank you, Deepti. I just want to do a quick time check. I think, how are we doing?
Have 20 minutes to go.
Awesome, fantastic. Deepti, do you want to take some questions? I think we've had a bunch of questions come in, and we can revisit right at the end. I think you had a question. Awesome, wonderful.
I'll give a mic.
Yeah, of course.
I don't know. I previously did.
Yeah.
But it was
Oh, got it.
All right.
Okay.
Go ahead.
There are questions virtually. Do you see them on screen or?
Here
Okay.
live, and then we can go to virtual
Oh,
right
okay.
after.
Thank you, Deepti. Thank you, Anik. I learned a lot. Really enjoyed your talk. I had a question. The first, as an acquiree, as a company, the first reaction of an employee would be like if I'm getting acquired, would be, anxious, like what's going to happen to my job? A lot of uncertainty. I mean, that's the first thing that comes to mind. I know you cannot guarantee that the employees could be staying, But what assurance do you give them that, hey, your job will be safe?
Yeah. And this is why I think figuring out it, so it firstly you've hit the nail on the head. It is absolutely the first thing that people think is, do I have a job? And then is it going to pay me the same as I like am I still going to earn the same as I am today? And they both come to the same heart of it, which is security. Yeah. Um, and that's why I always say you should at least directionally know the treatment of your people, how that's going to end up in the negotiation before you communicate, because it is unfair to either set false expectations or create false anxiety that isn't necessary. So just you should be able to answer those two questions before you communicate out to people. That's the only fair and appropriate way of doing it, right? So I think like everyone wants to hear, I have a job and my compensation will be the same or better. Like that's the ideal case scenario. But even if that is not the answer, what I've learned is that people value transparency over not knowing. So if your answer is, you know what, that's not like for instance, there was a company that we were in acquisition talks with where we were not going to take their G&A population, the support functions like HR, finance, legal, etc. Those folks were not going to be a part of the transaction for better or worse. Um, but being honest about that and saying, this is where it is, like you all will have jobs for 6 months, but after that, you're not going to, just allows people to plan. Like rather than living in the anxiety around it, I think people crave just transparency and being treated as adults, even if the answer is unpleasant. And too many companies avoid that difficult conversation because it's awkward or someone might leave, like I need this person for the 6 months. I can't afford to tell them that straight away. And I just think if you treat people fairly, they recognize that and they see how they're being treated and they respond in kind.
Great. Thanks, Deepti.
Mhm.
Appreciate it.
We have one more question.
My question is like, I'm building my company right now, and my product is a software. And through the partnership I've been making, what if a company, like a certain company, wants to acquire a certain amount of percentage or the entire company? As an early stage entrepreneur, I'm not aware of many things. So one of the important things I should be aware of.
Yeah, it's a great question. And this comes back to like, what's the kind of transaction, right? Like the asset deal or share deal. I think, and I could be so like, correct me if I'm mishearing it or misunderstanding it. But I think what you're talking about is like a company making an initial investment, say, I'm going to buy 10% of your shares and be, an investor in your company, and then potentially expanding that to at some point becoming an owner. So starting with some kind of partnership and then expanding it into ownership. And let me actually pause there. Is that how you were thinking about it in your question? Oh, just even a thumbs up or
I'm on
thumbs
it.
down. So
Can you repeat the question? I didn't get it.
yeah. So, like the way I'm interpreting your question, I just want to make sure that I'm understanding it correctly. I think what I picked up was that a company makes an investment first, like say buys 10% of your shares, but like as a partnership, and then slowly over time expands to become an owner by buying larger and larger proportion of the company. Is that correct? Am I understanding you correctly?
Yes. For example, I'm making partnership with the Eventbrite, right? So they might want to acquire the entire business, for example. I'm willing to give them 20% through the partnership, but they want to acquire the entire company. So the things I should be aware of. That's the question.
Yeah. I mean, I would say probably the number one thing you want to do in that case is get a transaction lawyer who protects your company, protects your IP, and then I don't know like the size of your company, but someone who is able to give you advice on how you negotiate your own and your team's contracts right at the outset. Like those are probably two big things that you want to make sure that are protected in during the course of the conversation. right? And if you have any doubt, then you stick to a partnership agreement, prove out the success of the partnership, and then both sides might feel much better about an acquisition in the future.
Just to
I've
add,
also seen companies, sorry, and just one last thing. I've also seen companies structure it as hurdles that say, hey, look, you can buy a 10% stake in us right now. Let's start this partnership. When the revenue that we do together gets to 50 million, automatically you increase your stake to be a 20% stake. And when the revenue we do together gets to 100 million, you increase your stake until at some point you're an owner, but at that point we're a 200 million run rate company, kind of.
yeah, I was just going to add too. I think that there's a layer of consideration around investors too. If you have investors in your company, I think that's something to consider right away. They might have certain feelings about a partnership versus being acquired, and again, any controlling stake in the company that you are founding or are a founder of. I think that's something worth considering. I want to actually add a quick note on what Deep just said around sort of hurdles or milestones, as you would call it. I've actually seen this concept deployed very successfully for both deal structuring, but also post-deal and integration as a way to incentivize employees to stay. So I think that's something that I think I would love to talk to you about, Deepti, as well. But I think that's a concept that's used in a way to ultimately guarantee that specific individuals, or if it's a situation where it's a talent play, where the talent sticks around for at least for a certain period of time, creating sort of a level of retention. So yeah, Deepti, if you want to add anything around that concept of golden handcuffs, quote unquote.
Like there's different kinds of golden handcuffs, right? There's the kind that says, hey, if we make this much amount of revenue, or whatever the metric is, I use revenue loosely, but if we make this amount of revenue, then you get more equity in our company, or like you gain personally from hitting certain metrics. That's great, because that's an incentive to just make this successful, and it ties you all into the same success metric. There's the other kind of golden handcuff, which is more like an earnout, which means I'm buying your company for, I don't know, whatever, $100 million, but you're not going to get the money, even though you're the owner, except over 3 years if you hit certain hurdles or if you hit certain milestones. If you don't hit those milestones, then that money comes into question. That's like basically transferring all the risk to you, the individual, the acquiring company, the acquirer. So you've got to, this is why I said, get a corporate lawyer, transaction lawyer straight away to figure out how to protect yourself, because this is like, that's not the ideal case scenario. It's just a matter of who has the risk in the negotiation and who has the gain. Because in every transaction, it's a risk reward spectrum, and you just got to figure out which side of that equation you're sitting on.
Thank you. Marita, can we read out some questions that we've gotten? I don't know if the session is the correct screen to be on, but I'd love to.
It is the correct screen, and I will be happy to read some of those. From Anthony, I think this question was interesting. From your perspective, how and why do you think so many mergers fail?
Yeah, I kind of feel like we talked about that already a little bit earlier on. So happy to jump into it if we think that it hasn't been addressed yet, but I feel like we jumped into that.
Okay, then another question was about banking industry merger and acquisitions this year, and your take on it, if there's something you can tell.
So I am not close to the banking industry, so I do not have any, and I would hate to misguide or say something wrong. So I do not have anything specific to the banking industry. But what I will say, and I think many of you know, it's a very different environment for 2021, which means there's a fair amount of companies that are fiscally challenged and are running out of cash runway. And what I do see, banking aside, across the board, is consolidation. A lot of companies are today, and I would say this over the next 12 months, I anticipate it to continue being a trend, that companies are exiting through acquisition, partly because they built something really great, and their valuation currently might be lower than it was in 2021, which makes them a lucrative target with a lot of value in front of them to be earned and had. So So yeah, I don't know if that's the same in banking specifically or not, but it's certainly a trend in the ecosystem in general.
I'll add a couple of sentences there. So I'm coming out of out of the fintech industry myself, so I've just witnessed a little bit from the technology side of the spectrum. I think one thing that has emerged as a trend within the banking industry that has led to consolidation, to Deepti's point, is the sort of lack of differentiation between different financial institutions. There's a really big premium on things like as simple as user experience for big banks. And it's really tough for smaller banks to actually compete with the bigger banks on that. So that's partly what directly from my experience I've witnessed within the banking industry. Why is there so much M&A? I think that is actually one part of the much larger story that I think is worth highlighting of smaller institutions in general are just having a tougher time competing when it comes to both resourcing and this concept of being large and having lots of deposits essentially coming in the door. So I think that's part of what I'd like to. I hope that helps answer the question, frankly.
Thank you. I see other questions, but I think we've covered most of them. Like, for example, this what are, like, for example, how founders and employees are contractually obligated to stay after the deal. So it's, I think you, Dipti, mentioned that it depends on the actual offer and it's different from deal to deal. If you want to deep dive in this, we're happy to hear, but I think we've covered most of the questions that we've already have for this session. Thank you.
All right. Deepti, do you want to add anything at the end here? I think this conversation from my perspective has been wonderful, and I think your knowledge and sharing that knowledge is extremely valuable. So I hope the audience has agreed and felt the same. You are a true expert in this, and even I've learned a lot just from today's conversation. So really appreciate that.
Well, thank you all for your thoughtful questions, your patience. I love the dialogue that's happening in chat, and I'm glad it spurred a few kind of sources of input. And I'm glad that I could share my experience as much as it helps anyone. Like I always love to be able to do that. So thank you. It's been an enjoyable hour.
Thank you, Deepti, and thank you again to everybody as well. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you very much.